Your buddy thought he was hot stuff when he rolled up in that orbit orange Pontiac GTO Judge, those wild the Judge decals screaming down the sides like something ripped straight out of a Saturday morning cartoon. That Ram air hood scoop was pointing skyward like it was ready for takeoff, and he was revving that Pontiac 400 just to make sure everyone on the block knew he'd bought the wildest thing ever to roll off a Detroit assembly line. Then your neighbor's kid came home from college driving his dad's Boss 429 Mustang, and suddenly that Judge didn't look quite so intimidating anymore. This is the story of two completely different philosophies about what made a muscle car great. Pontiac's Wild Child, a machine that looked like it had escaped from a comic book, versus Ford's hand-built NASCAR weapon, a car that cost more than some people's houses. The outrageous street fighter against the exclusive racing machine. Here's what's going to shock you. One of these cars could consistently embarrass the other at nearly every drag strip in America. But it wasn't the one everyone expected. And wait until you hear what happened when the magazines finally got both cars on the same track for a true head-to-head comparison. The Pontiac GTO Judge wasn't born in some corporate boardroom where executives worried about image, polish, and respectability. This car was Pontiac's middle finger to anyone who thought muscle cars should be subtle, conservative, or grown-up. Your typical muscle car in 1969 came in respectable colors like black, white, or maybe a nice blue. Pontiac looked at that and said no, then created Orbit Orange, a color so bright, NASA probably tracked it on radar. And they didn't stop there. They slapped the Judge decals down the sides in letters big enough to read from 3 lanes away. The Judge originally started as Pontiac's answer to Plymouth's budget Roadrunner, but somewhere during development, the engineers got carried away. Instead of building a cheap muscle car, they created something that looked like a Hot Wheels car brought to life. That rear spoiler wasn't there for aerodynamics. It was there to let everyone know you'd officially stopped caring what the neighbors thought. Walking up to a Judge felt like approaching something that had escaped from a drag strip. The Ram air hood with those twin scoops looked ready to inhale small children, and when the owner fired it up, that distinctive Pontiac rumble could wake the dead 2 counties over. But here's what separated the Judge from other flashy muscle cars. Underneath all that cartoon wildness was serious mechanical business, enough to back up every outrageous claim painted on the sides. And while Pontiac was busy building wild street cars, Ford was trying to solve a completely different problem. Their racing engineers were getting embarrassed by Chrysler's 426 Hemi engines in NASCAR. And Ford's response was the Boss 429, a magnificent piece of engineering that flowed air like a hurricane. NASCAR rules said you had to build 500 street versions to make your racing engine legal. Ford could have put this monster in the Galaxy or the Torino, the cars they were actually racing. But somebody in Dearborn had a different idea. Let's stuff it in a Mustang, they said. That would really show everyone they meant serious business. The Boss 429 was so massive that Ford had to completely re-engineer the Mustang just to make it fit. They cut shock towers, relocated suspension components, moved the battery to the trunk, and essentially hand-built every single car at CarCraft in Brighton, Michigan. At $4,172, a Boss 429 cost serious money. More than a new Corvette. More than most people made in an entire year. Ford only built 859 of them in 1969, and 499 more in 1970. These were not cars you could walk into any dealer and order. They were limited production masterpieces that required special connections just to see one. When your friend's dad finally brought one home, the entire neighborhood came out to look. That massive shaker hood scoop dominated the engine bay, and when he fired it up, the sound was pure NASCAR fury, barely contained by mufflers. Everyone assumed this hand-built racing machine would dominate everything on the road. That assumption was about to get seriously tested. Here is where things get interesting, and where Ford probably wishes the magazines had minded their own business. When Car and Driver tested a Boss 429, they managed 14.09 seconds in the quarter mile at 102 miles per hour. Motor Trend did slightly better with 13.9 seconds, but both magazines noted the same thing. For a hand-built racing engine, the Boss felt surprisingly lazy off the line. Meanwhile, Hot Rod magazine got their hands on a Pontiac GTO Judge with the standard Ram Air 3 engine and recorded 14.45 seconds at 98 miles per hour. Not earth-shattering, but remember, this was the base engine in a car that cost significantly less than the Boss. Then, Superstock and Drag Illustrated tested a Judge with the optional Ram Air 4 engine, and the results made Ford engineers question everything they thought they knew about street performance. The Judge ran 13.58 seconds at 105.5 miles per hour, consistently outrunning the Boss 429, while costing about $500 less. The real embarrassment came when both cars showed up at the same drag strip on the same night. Your buddy in the Judge was running consistent 13.6-second passes, while the Boss 429 owner was struggling just to break into the 13s. Word spread quickly through the muscle car community that Pontiac's Wild Child was outrunning Ford's hand-built masterpiece, but the performance gap was not the only surprise in this showdown. The Boss 429's problems started with Ford's basic approach to the project. They had built a pure racing engine, designed to run wide open at Daytona and Talladega, then tried to make it civilized enough for your average weekend warrior to drive to work. Racing engines do not care about idle quality, emissions compliance, or pump gas compatibility. They are designed to make maximum power at high RPM for hours at a time. When Ford tried to make the 429 street legal, they had to compromise nearly everything that made it special. The compression ratio was lowered from full race specification to something that would not destroy pistons on pump gas. The Wild camshaft was tamed for smoother idle quality and neighborhood-friendly exhaust manners. The carburation was sized for drivability and emissions, rather than maximum airflow. What Ford ended up with was an engine that made impressive power at 6,000 RPM, but felt disappointingly sluggish everywhere a real street driver actually lived. The Boss 429 was happiest above 4,500 RPM, which meant it felt lazy at stoplights and uninspiring during normal driving. And things only got worse from there. That massive 429 cubic inch engine made the Mustang seriously nose-heavy, hurting both acceleration and handling. Ford tried to compensate with suspension changes, but you cannot cheat physics. A nose-heavy car does not launch as hard as a balanced one, and it certainly does not handle worth a damn. Your typical Boss 429 owner eventually discovered they had bought the most expensive Mustang Ford ever built, and it still could not outrun cars costing half as much. Pontiac's approach with the Judge was completely different, and it explains exactly why the car succeeded where Ford's masterpiece failed. Instead of trying to civilize a race engine for the street, Pontiac built street engines that simply happened to make serious power. The Ram Air engines started life as production power plants, designed from the beginning for real-world driving. Compression ratios were aggressive but not insane. The camshafts were hot, but still allowed smooth, idle quality and reasonable drivability in traffic. Most importantly, these engines made their power in the RPM range where people actually drove. The Ram Air 3, standard in the Judge, made 366 horsepower and 445 pound-feet of torque with a power band that came alive around 2,500 RPM and pulled hard to 5,500. The result was a car that felt strong everywhere you used it, from stoplight launches to highway passing. The optional Ram Air 4 was even more impressive. Officially rated at 370 horsepower, it was actually making closer to 390. Unlike the Boss 429, which had to be spun hard to make power, the Ram Air 4 delivered massive torque right off idle and never stopped pulling. Pontiac also understood something Ford overlooked entirely. Weight distribution mattered. The 400 cubic inch engine was large enough to make serious power, yet compact enough to fit naturally in the Pontiac GTO platform without requiring major structural modifications. The result was a car that launched hard, handled reasonably well, and delivered consistent performance, whether you were cruising to the drive-in or terrorizing the local drag strip. Best of all, you could walk into any Pontiac dealer and order one. No special connections were required. No waiting lists. No astronomical prices. The Judge represented accessible performance for anyone brave enough to be seen in Orbit Orange. By 1970, the underground street racing scene had delivered its verdict, and it was not kind to Ford's hand-built masterpiece. Judges were becoming legends at drag strips across America, consistently running times that made other muscle car owners question their automotive choices. The Judge earned a reputation as the giant killer, a car that looked like a cartoon brought to life, yet could embarrass anything foolish enough to line up next to it. Word spread quickly through the muscle car community that the wildest-looking car on the road was also one of the fastest. Boss 429 owners, meanwhile, were learning expensive lessons about the difference between racing credentials and real street performance. These cars were slowly becoming garage queens, beautiful to look at, but disappointing to drive. The few owners who truly understood how to extract performance from the 429 could make them competitive, but it required a level of skill most street racers simply did not possess. A typical Friday night at the local drag strip told the real story. Judges were running consistent 13.6-second passes with bone stock engines and street tires. Boss 429s, on the other hand, were struggling just to break into the 14s without serious modifications and careful tuning. The hand-built racing machine was being consistently outrun by the mass-produced street fighter. The magazines caught on quickly. Road Test called the Judge the most honest muscle car ever tested, while noting that the Boss 429 promised more than it actually delivered. Hot Rod was even more brutal, stating that the Judge made the Boss 429 look like an expensive mistake. The 429's failure was not the result of bad engineering. It was the result of building the wrong car for the market Ford was trying to serve. The muscle car era was about accessible performance, cars that any working guy could afford and enjoy. Ford built an exclusive and expensive machine that required expert knowledge just to extract its potential. Ford's marketing department also oversold what they had created. They positioned the Boss 429 as the ultimate street fighter when it was actually a compromised racing engine that merely happened to be street legal. When the magazines began testing the car and posting mediocre real-world results, Ford's credibility took a hit that lasted for years. And the pricing strategy only made things worse. At over $4,000, the Boss 429 cost serious money in an era when most muscle cars sold for well under $3,500. Ford was asking customers to pay premium prices for disappointing street performance, and the market responded exactly as you would expect. The average muscle car buyer looked at the numbers and made the obvious choice. Why pay extra for a temperamental racing engine when you could get better real-world performance from Pontiac's proven street fighter? The Boss 429's exclusivity quickly became a liability rather than an asset. Ford quietly killed the Boss 429 program after 1970, officially blaming emissions regulations and insurance concerns. Unofficially, they had realized they built a magnificent engine in the wrong car, for the wrong market, at the wrong price. The Pontiac GTO Judge succeeded because Pontiac understood something Ford completely missed. Muscle car buyers wanted cars that looked wild, sounded mean, and could back up their aggressive appearance with legitimate performance. The Judge delivered on all three. Pontiac built 6,833 Judges in 1969 and 3,797 more in 1970, making it far more successful than Ford's exclusive approach. The Judge proved you could build an outrageous-looking car with serious performance at reasonable prices, and the market rewarded that honesty. The Judge also aged far better than the Boss 429. While Ford's racing engine became increasingly temperamental as emissions regulations tightened, Pontiac's street-oriented philosophy meant the Judge remained drivable and reliable throughout its production run. Today's collector car market tells a fascinating story about both approaches. A clean Boss 429 now brings $200,000 to $300,000 at auction, driven partly by rarity and partly by the NASCAR mystique collectors love. A comparable Judge brings $60,000 to $90,000. Serious money, but significantly less than the Boss. And here lies the irony. Muscle car enthusiasts still debate. The less valuable car was actually the better real-world performer. The Judge could outrun the Boss in most street situations, while costing less to buy, less to maintain, and less to insure. Yet the Boss 429's rarity and racing heritage make it more collectible today. This was the ultimate showdown between Ford's most expensive dream and Pontiac's wildest reality. The Boss 429 was a magnificent piece of engineering that failed as a street car because Ford forgot the single most important rule of muscle cars. When you pressed the throttle, it actually had to be fast. The Pontiac GTO Judge was everything great about the muscle car era, rolled into one outrageous package: honest performance, reasonable pricing, and the willingness to go completely over the top. It proved you could build a car that looked like a Hot Wheels fantasy and still deliver legitimate, real-world speed. So now the question becomes simple. Which philosophy speaks to you? Do you prefer the Boss 429's exclusivity and racing pedigree, even knowing it could not back up its reputation on the street? Or do you respect the Judge's honest performance and in-your-face attitude, even if it looked like it escaped from a comic book? Let us know in the comments, and get ready for a debate that has been raging since 1970. Now pick a side. Street-proven Judge, or Rare Boss 429 Legend. Which one wins your money, your garage, and your pride? If this showdown taught you something new about what really mattered in the muscle car wars, hit the like button and subscribe to American Muscle Soul and ride with us every day.